The pale light of dawn filtered through the hospital blinds, casting weak lines of gold onto the sterile white walls. The ICU was a symphony of mechanical beeps, hushed voices, and the constant whisper of ventilators. In room 309, the air was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and fading hope. Eleanor Ward's fingers, delicate and trembling, adjusted the corner of a crisp white sheet covering the motionless figure on the bed. The millionaire's face was pallid, his chest rising and falling only with the assistance of the ventilator. His name was Marcus Caldwell, a man who had once conquered boardrooms and stock markets, who had been the subject of countless glossy magazine covers. Now he was reduced to a whisper of a man, tethered to life by the thin thread of technology. Eleanor sighed, feeling the familiar pang in her chest. She was a nurse, a seasoned one, accustomed to loss and grief, but some cases burrowed under her skin, refusing to let go. Marcus Caldwell was one of them. A wall-mounted clock ticked above her, each second chipping away at inevitability. Eleanor was aware of the impending decision. Marcus's family had held on for months. A parade of well-dressed strangers, faces etched with a mixture of guilt and expectation. They visited less frequently now, their grief calcified into cold acceptance. They had finally made their decision. Today they would let him go. She stood by the bed, her gaze tracing the thin lines of Marcus's face. The sharp jaw, now hollowed by weeks of stagnation. His hands, once strong enough to shape fortunes, now lay limp by his side. She remembered seeing him in the news years ago, always in dark suits, a golden watch glinting from beneath a cufflink. He was powerful, distant, untouchable. And now, she swallowed, pushing back the bitterness of unspoken thoughts. No one was untouchable when fate decided otherwise. Eleanor glanced at her reflection in the window pane. 39 years old, with soft eyes that seemed too weary for her age. Her auburn hair was swept into a tight bun, a habit drilled into her by years of nursing school. Her cheeks were pale, and the faint shadows under her eyes told stories of sleepless nights. Nights when memories clawed their way out of the darkness, whispering of things lost, mistakes made. Outside the window, the city stirred. Traffic lights blinked rhythmically, cars crept forward, and life carried on. But inside room 309, time stood still. Marcus's breathing was the only movement, borrowed breaths, each one precarious. Eleanor moved to the bedside chair and sat down, her eyes still on Marcus's face. A whisper of something, guilt, regret, coiled in her stomach. He was just another patient, she told herself. Another soul passing through the liminal space between life and death. But it wasn't true, and she knew it. A muffled knock interrupted her thoughts. The door opened slowly, and Dr. Thompson entered. His salt and pepper hair was disheveled, and his eyes held that careful detachment doctors wore like armor. "It's time, Eleanor," he said softly. "The family is ready." Her heart clenched. She nodded, the professional mask slipping over her features. Rising from the chair, she moved mechanically, her body a vessel for practiced routine. She checked the monitors, noted the vitals, and ensured the 4 lines were clear. Her fingers trembled slightly, a betrayal she ignored. Dr. Thompson placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm, grounding. "You don't have to be here for this." She shook her head. "I want to be." He studied her for a moment, something unspoken in his gaze. He nodded once and left the room. The door closed with a soft click, and silence filled the space between her and Marcus. Eleanor leaned down, her face close to his ear, her voice a whisper only the walls would remember. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I hope, wherever you go next, it's kinder." She straightened and turned toward the machines, her hand reaching for the ventilator switch. The motion felt heavy, as though unseen hands pressed against her chest. Then she stopped. A shiver ran through her, the hairs on her neck standing on end. Her eyes widened as she looked down at Marcus. The world narrowed to a pinpoint, her breath caught in her throat. His eyes, those eyes that had been closed for months, were open. They were staring directly at her, and they were filled with something raw and terrifying. Recognition. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, each thud a deafening echo in the sterile room. Her breath caught as she met Marcus's eyes, dark and haunted, like wells that hid something unfathomable. The machines continued their steady hum, oblivious to the impossible moment unraveling before her. This isn't real, her mind screamed, but the cold stab of recognition in his gaze told her otherwise. She took a trembling step back, nearly knocking over the four-stand. Her hands flew to her mouth to stifle the gasp that escaped. Marcus Caldwell, the man declared lost to the world, was awake, or was he? His body remained motionless, but his eyes followed her every movement. Mr. Caldwell? Her voice was a fragile thread, barely audible. He didn't respond, but the intensity of his stare deepened, and she felt it like a weight pressing down on her chest. A sudden rush of memories she couldn't place crashed through her mind. It was as though his gaze had ignited a door inside her, one she'd kept locked for years, the door to a past she'd long buried. A sharp knock at the door jolted her back. Eleanor turned abruptly, her pulse roaring in her ears. Dr. Thompson's voice drifted through the door, muffled and distant. "Eleanor? Everything all right?" She swallowed hard, glancing back at Marcus. His eyes were closed again, his expression slack and empty. The moment was gone. Her knees wobbled beneath her, uncertainty clawing at her composure. "Why, yes," she managed to say, her voice barely steady. "I just need another minute." "All right, the family is waiting in the hallway," Dr. Thompson replied, his voice tinged with gentle urgency. She heard his footsteps retreating. The weight of the decision, of what she had seen, what she had felt, crushed her. Was she losing her mind? Was it a trick of exhaustion, of grief? Turning back to Marcus, she studied his face again. The stillness was absolute. There was no sign of the man who had looked at her just moments ago. The machines ticked on, recording his vital signs without change. Did I imagine it? Her fingers brushed her forehead, damp with cold sweat. She could hear the muted chatter of Marcus's family just outside the door. A family ready to bury a man who might not be gone. But if she said something now, if she told them she thought he had woken up, they'd dismiss her. They'd call it a mistake, an emotional reaction from a nurse who was too invested in her patient. What if they're right? Eleanor's thoughts churned, a storm of fear and doubt. But then, a memory fluttered at the edge of her mind. A memory she hadn't summoned in years. A rainy night, headlights flashing through the downpour, screeching tires, the shattering impact of metal on metal. Her breath hitched, the forgotten trauma pressed against her skull like a vice, blurry images bleeding into the present. Her hands went clammy, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. And then she knew. Her gaze snapped back to Marcus. The impossible feeling of recognition she'd experienced moments ago surged through her veins. It wasn't just a trick of exhaustion. That look in his eyes, the raw clarity. She knew that look. Somewhere, somehow, she knew Marcus Caldwell. Her legs felt like lead as she stumbled to the chair and sank into it. The cold metal bit into her palms as she gripped the armrests, grounding herself. She closed her eyes and took a shaky breath, forcing herself to confront the foggy images crowding her mind. The accident, the screams, blood on her hands. A life she couldn't save, no, a life she thought she couldn't save. But who had been in the other car? A chill whispered through her as the memories began to coalesce, forming a clearer picture. It wasn't just a random accident. It was a crossroads of fate, a moment where two lives collided in more ways than one. The details were hazy, but a dark certainty lodged itself in her chest. Marcus Caldwell wasn't a stranger. He was a ghost from her past, buried under layers of guilt and forgotten trauma. A soft moan escaped her lips. Her head swam with dizziness. The door opened gently, and Dr. Thompson stepped inside, his eyes filled with quiet concern. "Eleanor," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We need to proceed." She swallowed, her throat dry and tight. Her gaze flickered to Marcus, his face a mask of stillness, the weight of secrets resting heavy on his chest, on hers. She didn't know how, but they were connected. and disconnecting his life support now would sever a thread that was more tangled and intricate than she understood. But could she say it? Could she stop this decision based on the trembling whisper of a memory she couldn't fully grasp? Dr. Thompson's hand was on her shoulder again, the pressure anchoring her. "Eleanor, are you sure you're okay?" She nodded, her mind a tempest. "Just give me one more moment," she whispered. She turned to Marcus, her heart pounding. And this time she leaned in close, her lips next to his ear. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice shaking. "If you can hear me, if you're there, give me a sign." For a moment nothing happened. But then his finger twitched, the faintest, most imperceptible movement. But it was enough. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes fixed on Marcus's hand, willing it to move again, to prove she wasn't losing her mind. But his fingers lay still now, as if mocking her desperation. The machines continued their rhythmic chorus, beeps, hums, hisses, the indifferent soundtrack to lives on the edge. Did I imagine it? The door opened quietly, and Dr. Thompson's voice brought her back into the room. "Eleanor," he said, his tone firmer now. "We really can't wait any longer. The family." "I saw him move," she blurted out, her voice cracking. Dr. Thompson's eyes narrowed, concern and skepticism mingling in his gaze. "Eleanor, you've been under a lot of pressure. Maybe you need a break." "Sometimes." "No," she insisted, a shaky resolve hardening her voice. His eyes opened earlier. He looked at me, and just now his finger moved. Dr. Thompson's jaw tightened. He glanced at Marcus's motionless body, then back at Eleanor. The weariness in his eyes deepened. "These cases are hard. The mind plays tricks. We've done every test. There's no brain activity." Eleanor's throat constricted. The doubt in his voice ignited something raw in her chest, a spark of defiance she hadn't felt in years. "I know what I saw," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, just one more test. We owe him that." Dr. Thompson's eyes softened, but his shoulders sagged with resignation. He nodded reluctantly. "I'll call for a neurologist to run a final check. But if the results are the same, Eleanor, you need to be prepared." She nodded, though her heart clenched. As he left the room, Eleanor's fingers trembled. She looked back at Marcus, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. She leaned in close to him again. Her voice was a whisper of hope and fear intertwined. "Marcus, please," she said. "I know you're in there. I don't know how, but I know. If you can hear me, I need you to hold on. Just a little longer." Her eyes searched his face for any sign, any flicker of response. Nothing. She exhaled shakily, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fragments of memories she couldn't quite piece together. Her hands clenched the edge of the bed as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. And then she saw it. Just beneath his collarbone, a faint scar, almost hidden by the folds of his hospital gown. A jagged, thin line, barely noticeable, but enough to send a bolt of recognition through her. She knew that scar. Sudden nausea twisted her stomach. Her vision blurred as the memories surged again. Stronger this time. The rain, the crash, the broken windshield. Her hands trembling as she pulled him, from the wreckage. The scar was from that night. She stumbled back, her mind reeling. A wave of guilt crashed over her, dark and suffocating. How had she not recognized him sooner? How had she buried that night so deep, until it clawed its way out now, in the most brutal of moments? The door creaked open again. Eleanor wiped her face hastily, trying to mask the turmoil that must have been written across her features. A young woman stepped inside, late 20s, with high cheekbones and a cold, hollow beauty. Marcus's daughter, Lydia Caldwell. Her designer black dress clung to her frame like armor, her eyes guarded. "We're ready," Lydia said softly, though her voice carried no warmth. Eleanor's heart twisted. How could she explain to this woman that the father she'd already mourned might still be within reach? That hope, cruel and fragile, hadn't fully died yet? "Miss Caldwell," Eleanor started, forcing herself to speak calmly. "I know this is difficult, but I need to ask for a little more time. Lydia's gaze hardened, a glimmer of irritation breaking through her practiced grief. We've given him time, months of time. We've grieved. He wouldn't want this, to be trapped like this. Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the strain beneath the veneer. Please don't make this harder than it already is. Eleanor's fingers curled into fists at her sides. The words were on her tongue, fighting to be released. The memory, the scar, the movement. But how could she make them understand when she barely understood herself? Before she could speak, Lydia's eyes flickered to Marcus. She stepped closer to the bed, her hand trembling as she reached for her father's limp fingers. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I hope you know that. I hope you can forgive me." The anguish in her words cracked something open in Eleanor's heart. This wasn't just a cold family saying goodbye. There were layers here, pain and regret that ran deeper than Eleanor had realized. Lydia's eyes met Eleanor's, pleading and exhausted. "Please, let us end this." Eleanor's chest constricted. The weight of the decision felt unbearable, the burden of 2 lives, maybe more, hanging in the balance. Her voice came out ragged. "Give me an hour," she whispered. "1 hour. If nothing changes, I'll honor your wishes." Lydia's jaw tightened, tears welling in her eyes. Finally, she nodded. 1 hour. She turned and left the room, the door closing softly behind her. Eleanor sank into the chair, her heart pounding. 1 hour. A fragile sliver of time, balancing on the edge of a knife. She leaned in close to Marcus, desperation in her voice. "Please, Marcus," she whispered. "If there's anything left of you in there, now is the time to come back. I know you. I don't know how or why, but I do. We both survived that night. We both deserve a second chance." She gripped his hand, her fingers cold against his warm skin. And then, so faintly she almost didn't believe it, his hand squeezed back. The faint squeeze of Marcus's hand felt like an electric jolt through Eleanor's veins. Her breath caught, and for a moment, the world around her dimmed, leaving only the fragile connection between them. The machines continued their monotonous beeping, oblivious to the miracle unfolding. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know you're in there. Hold on for me, please." She stared at his hand, willing it to move again, desperate for confirmation that this wasn't just a cruel trick of her imagination. Her fingers curled tightly around his, the warmth of his skin anchoring her. But nothing happened. Her hope faltered, teetering on the edge of despair. Was it possible she'd imagined it? The pressure so slight, so fleeting. Maybe it was just a muscle spasm. Her mind twisted in uncertainty, but deep down, a part of her refused to let go. That part, buried beneath years of routine and emotional walls, was clawing its way to the surface now. The door creaked open again. Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes wild with fear and hope. Dr. Thompson walked in, followed by Dr. Ellis, the neurologist. His sharp, analytical eyes swept the room, landing on Eleanor with a clinical detachment that made her heart sink. "I hear we need a final assessment," Dr. Ellis said, his voice low and even. "We'll run a few tests. Standard procedure." Eleanor nodded, her hands shaking as she stepped back to let them work. She watched in silence as Dr. Ellis checked Marcus's reflexes, shone a light into his eyes, and murmured instructions to the attending nurse. Each minute felt like an eternity, the air growing heavier with each passing second. Finally, Dr. Ellis straightened, his face impassive. He turned to Dr. Thompson and shook his head. "There's no change, no signs of consciousness." "I'm sorry." The words slammed into Eleanor like a fist. Her knees buckled, and she grabbed the bed rail to steady herself. Her mind screamed in protest, but her voice refused to follow. Dr. Thompson's hand landed gently on her shoulder. "Eleanor, you've done everything you could. It's time." "No," she whispered, her eyes welling with tears. "He squeezed my hand. I know he did." Dr. Ellis's expression softened, but his voice was firm. "Sometimes the body reacts in ways that seem intentional, but the brain scans are conclusive." The walls of the room felt like they were closing in. The weight of defeat pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She looked at Marcus's face, his features serene and detached from the chaos swirling around him. And then, like a whisper from the depths of her mind, the memory surged forward, sharp and clear. The rain lashed against the windshield, each drop a tiny explosion of sound. Headlights blurred into streaks of white as she gripped the wheel, her knuckles pale and rigid. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The curve came too fast. The brakes screeched. Tires slid on wet asphalt. The sickening crunch of metal. Shattered glass. Darkness. When she opened her eyes, she was hanging upside down, the seatbelt biting into her shoulder. Pain flared through her body, hot and relentless. The air was filled with the smell of gasoline and burning rubber. And then she heard it, a groan. Faint, desperate, coming from the wreckage of the other car. Ignoring the pain, she unbuckled herself and crawled through the shattered window. Her hands bled from the glass, but she didn't care. The need to help, to save whoever was in that car, drove her forward. She reached the driver's side and saw a man slumped over the wheel. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead. His chest rose and fell in shallow, erratic breaths. "Hey!" she screamed, shaking him. "Stay with me." His eyes fluttered open, dark and glazed with pain. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a brief moment, she felt an inexplicable connection, a tether binding them together. "Help me," he whispered. "I will," she promised. "I won't leave you." But then the flames erupted, and the world turned to fire. The memory shattered through her, leaving her gasping. The connection was undeniable now. The man she tried to save, the man whose life had been entangled with hers in that moment of terror, was Marcus Caldwell. Her legs felt like jelly as she turned to Dr. Thompson, desperation surging through her like a tidal wave. "Please," she choked out, tears streaming down her face. "I know this sounds crazy, but he's in there. We survived that night together. I know he's still fighting. Give me more time. Just a little more time." Dr. Thompson's eyes narrowed, concern etching deep lines into his face. He glanced at Dr. Ellis, who shook his head, his expression unreadable. "We can't justify," Dr. Ellis began, but Dr. Thompson held up a hand, silencing him. He looked at Eleanor, his gaze piercing and thoughtful. For a long moment, the room was silent, the tension thick and suffocating. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and firm. "One more hour. That's all I can give you." Relief and dread tangled in Eleanor's chest. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Dr. Ellis sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "All right, 1 hour." They left the room, the door closing behind them with a finality that made Eleanor shudder. She turned back to Marcus, her heart pounding. The seconds were slipping away, each one a grain of sand in a fragile hourglass. "Marcus," she whispered, clutching his hand. "We survived once. I need you to fight now. Please, come back to me." A single tear slid down her cheek and landed on his hand. And this time, his fingers tightened around hers with unmistakable strength. Eleanor's heart leapt into her throat as Marcus's fingers curled around hers, his grip weak but intentional. Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out the sterile beeping of the machines. It was real. He was there. A sob broke from her lips, raw and full of disbelief. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're here. You're really here." His eyelids fluttered, the faintest flicker of effort passing over his face. Then, slowly, so painfully slowly, his eyes opened. The dark depths of his gaze met hers, clouded with confusion and exhaustion, but unmistakably alive. A spark of recognition flared between them, fragile yet electric. She swallowed hard, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her voice shook as she clung to his hand. "You're safe. You're not alone. I'm here." A low, guttural sound escaped his lips, more a breath than a word, but the effort etched lines of strain into his face. His eyes darted around the room, then fixed back on her, pleading and desperate. He was trapped, teetering between awareness and paralysis. Panic flashed in his gaze, and Eleanor's heart clenched. She squeezed his hand tighter, grounding him. "It's okay," she soothed. "You're going to be okay. We just need to let them know you're awake. I'll get the doctor." As she turned to leave, his fingers tightened around hers, surprising her with their strength. His lips moved, forming a word she barely caught. "Wait." She froze, her eyes widening. His voice was barely a whisper, so faint it could have been her imagination. But it wasn't. He'd spoken. He was fighting. Her breath caught. "Marcus, what is it? Tell me." He blinked slowly, exhaustion pulling at him. His lips trembled as he formed the words, each syllable a mountain he had to climb. "Don't leave." His plea pierced her to the core, awakening a memory she'd buried beneath years of survival and guilt. "Stay with me," he had whispered through the pain that night, and she had promised, though the flames had forced her to break it. A sob escaped her lips, guilt and determination merging in a torrent of emotion. She cupped his face gently, her hands trembling. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. "I won't leave you again." A tear slipped down his cheek, a mirror to her own grief. The machines beeped in steady rhythm, but now each sound felt like a pulse of hope, a lifeline being reknit between them. Eleanor took a shaky breath. She needed to act, needed to make sure this fragile thread of life didn't slip away. She pressed the call button on the wall, her fingers trembling with urgency. "Please," she whispered to the universe, to fate, to any force listening. "Please let this be enough." The door burst open moments later, Dr. Thompson and Dr. Ellis entering with urgency etched into their faces. Lydia followed close behind, her heels clicking sharply on the cold linoleum. Her face was a mask of disbelief and fear. "What happened?" Dr. Thompson asked, his eyes darting from Eleanor to Marcus. Eleanor stepped aside, her voice shaking. "He's awake. He spoke to me. He squeezed my hand." Dr. Ellis's face tightened, his skepticism clear. "Eleanor, we've run every—" "See for yourself," she interrupted, her voice laced with quiet fury. "Look at him. Really look at him." Dr. Thompson leaned in close, his eyes scanning Marcus's face. "Marcus," he said gently, "if you can hear me, can you blink?" A tense silence settled over the room. The air felt thick, the weight of possibility pressing down on everyone. Then, with immense effort, Marcus's eyelids lowered in a slow, deliberate blink. Gasps filled the room. Dr. Ellis stepped forward, his demeanor shifting from skepticism to shock. He pulled a penlight from his pocket and shone it into Marcus's eyes. The pupils constricted, sluggish but responsive. He's conscious," Dr. Ellis murmured, disbelief threading through his voice. Lydia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with tears. She took a hesitant step toward the bed, her composure cracking. "Dad?" she choked out, her voice breaking. "Is it really you?" Marcus's eyes found hers, and a tear slipped down his cheek. His lips trembled, forming the word she'd waited months to hear. "Lydia." Her sob broke free as she collapsed into the chair beside him, clutching his hand. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't think. I thought you were gone." Dr. Thompson's voice was gentle, but steady. "We need to stabilize him, run more tests. But this is a miracle." Eleanor stepped back, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. Relief mingled with a bittersweet ache in her chest. The weight of guilt she'd carried for years felt lighter now, like a chain finally breaking. As the medical team bustled around Marcus, she slipped quietly out of the room. The hallway stretched before her, sterile and cold, but for the first time in years, it felt like a path forward. She leaned against the wall, tears sliding down her face. The promise she'd made all those years ago, to stay, to help, had finally been honored. A quiet voice interrupted her thoughts. "You didn't give up on him." She looked up to see Lydia standing there, her eyes red-rimmed but grateful. "Thank you," Lydia whispered, "for fighting for him when we couldn't." Eleanor nodded, her heart swelling. "He fought too. He just needed someone to hear him." Lydia's lips trembled with a smile. We both did. As Lydia walked back into the room, Eleanor closed her eyes, the shadows of regret finally giving way to the light of redemption. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. For the first time in years, the path ahead was clear. Eleanor leaned against the cool hallway wall, the weight in her chest lifting like fog burned away by the first rays of dawn. The sterile scent of the hospital no longer felt suffocating. It was just air, clean, crisp, and new. The sense of finality she had braced for was replaced by a fragile yet undeniable hope. Marcus Caldwell had returned from the edge of oblivion, and with him, a part of Eleanor that she thought had died long ago. She took a deep breath, the tension in her shoulders finally easing. The door to Marcus's room was ajar, and through the sliver of space, she could see Lydia sitting by his side. The soft murmur of their voices, tentative, broken, but real, was a balm to Eleanor's weary soul. The chasm of grief between them was beginning to close, stitched together by second chances and unspoken apologies. The memories of that night, once jagged shards embedded in her heart, now felt like pieces of a story finally making sense. The crash that had bound their lives in tragedy was no longer an open wound. It was a scar, one that told a story of survival, resilience, and redemption. A gentle voice pulled her from her thoughts. Eleanor. She turned to see Dr. Thompson, his eyes soft with understanding. He held out a steaming cup of coffee, a silent offering. She took it, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. You were right, he said quietly, leaning against the wall beside her. We almost gave up too soon. Eleanor's throat tightened. I couldn't let that happen, she whispered. Not again. Dr. Thompson nodded, the weight of shared experiences hanging between them. It takes courage to hold on when everyone else lets go. She looked down at the coffee, her reflection rippling on the dark surface. Sometimes, it feels harder to hope than to surrender. He was silent for a moment, then spoke with a gentleness that reached deep into her heart. You reminded us that hope is worth the risk. Eleanor blinked back tears, her voice trembling. I think I needed to remind myself, too. A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of battles fought and burdens shared. The hallway, once a place of dread, now felt like a bridge between despair and possibility. Dr. Thompson straightened, offering her a small smile. Go home, Eleanor. Rest. You've earned it. She nodded, exhaustion pressing down on her, but it was a different kind of tired, one that promised sleep, not torment. As he walked away, she turned back to the door, peeking once more into Marcus's room. His eyes caught hers. He was awake, alert, and though his face was lined with weariness, there was a spark in his gaze. A spark that said, I remember. She took a step inside, hesitant but drawn by an invisible thread. Eleanor, he rasped, his voice weak but unmistakably real. You saved me. Again. Her breath caught, tears slipping down her cheeks. She took his hand gently, feeling the warmth of life in his grip. We saved each other, she whispered. His eyes softened, the unspoken weight of shared trauma and survival passing between them. I thought I'd never get a second chance, he murmured. She smiled through her tears. Sometimes, second chances come when we least expect them. Lydia watched them, her own tears glistening in her eyes. The room, once filled with the cold certainty of loss, now hummed with the quiet promise of healing. Eleanor knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Marcus's recovery would take time, and the shadows of the past wouldn't vanish overnight. But for the first time in years, she believed in the possibility of transformation, not just for Marcus but for herself. She gave his hand one last squeeze and turned to leave. The weight she'd carried for so long had finally lifted. The ghosts of regret had been laid to rest, replaced by the steady pulse of hope. As she stepped into the early morning light, the city's noise wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. The horizon glowed with the first hues of dawn, a sky washed in pale gold and lavender. A new day, a new chance, and for Eleanor that was enough.